Top 5 UFO Cases. Incredible Evidence. In this film, we'll examine some of the best UFO cases where not only the U.S. government was involved, but where the UFOs also left behind physical traces. Number 5. On October 18th, 1973, in Mansfield, Ohio, a U.S. Army Reserve 4 crew member helicopter training mission was ready for takeoff. In command was Major Coyne. Lieutenant Jetsey was at the controls. Also on board was Staff Sergeant Healy and Staff Sergeant Janasek. The crew took off from Port Columbus Airport at approximately 10:30 p.m. And shortly after takeoff, Staff Sergeant Janasek noticed a red light racing towards them from the horizon. He notified Major Coyne, who took the controls and attempted to avoid a collision. Although the helicopter was descending, the UFO matched their altitude and continued on a collision course. A family of 5 was driving by and stopped to observe the 2 aircraft. The red light turned off on the front end of the UFO, and a green pyramid-shaped light came on at the rear and swung 90 degrees, bathing the helicopter with this light. The red instrument lights inside the helicopter also turned green. Major Coyne still had the controls set for a descent. However, the helicopter was ascending with the UFO from 1,500 feet up above 3,500 feet, climbing at 1,000 feet per minute. The green light turned off and the UFO shot off to the north over Lake Erie. The crew completed their training mission and landed at Cleveland Hopkins Airport. A maintenance crew inspecting the helicopter discovered that the magnetic compass was not functioning properly and it was replaced. The crew officially reported the incident to the Flight Operations Office. Here are their signatures. Here is a drawing of the unidentified object that they saw. It was a cigar-shaped airfoil with a dome on top, 50 to 60 feet in length, 15 to 20 feet in height. It was metallic and gray in color with a red light on the leading edge and a green light on the trailing edge, which also had a concave surface. Colonel Robert Friend, Project Blue Book director at the time, interviewed the crewmen and was impressed by their minute-by-minute detailed account, and especially by their professionalism during the high stress of the incident. In 1978, a group of diplomats and scientists met to discuss the formation of a United Nations UFO study group. The group was spearheaded by Sir Eric Gary, Prime Minister of Grenada. Members of the group presented the proposal to the General Assembly. 3 of the members who were invited to speak were Dr. J. Allen Hynek, Jacques Vallée, and Major Coyne, each of whom spoke from the seat of Grenada. Although there was initial interest, funding for such a study group was never approved. Number 4. On December 29, 1980, in the Piney Woods area of Texas, Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, and her grandson Colby Landrum were on their way to play bingo. But little did they know that the bingo hall was closed for the holidays. They decided to drive to another bingo hall and discovered it too was also closed. Not to waste a trip, they decided to have dinner nearby. After dinner, they were driving back home when Colby suddenly noticed a strange object above the tree line. pointed it out to the two women who thought it was a plane coming in for a landing. That is, until it descended into the roadway in front of them. Suddenly, their vehicle shut off, and Betty and Vicky got out of the car to get a closer look at this strange diamond-shaped object shooting lightning bolts. But the heat was too intense, and Vicky got back inside the car. The UFO was a large, dark, diamond-shaped object with a glow surrounding it. There was lightning shooting from the bottom of the object and intense heat. The lightning stopped and was replaced by a bright flame. Burst of flame caused the object to bob up and down as if the object was trying to lift off. At one point, Betty couldn't take the heat any longer and decided to go back to the car. When she touched the door handle, she burned her hand. Betty used her leather jacket to open the door and got inside the car. The three of them watched as the UFO continued to bob up and down. Then they heard the sound of helicopters approaching. The helicopters came in and surrounded the UFO. Then the UFO seemed to be escorted away by the helicopters. The car suddenly turned on and lurched forward. Betty slammed on the brakes, and Vicky braced herself on the dashboard with her left hand, and an imprint from her hand was left in the softened plastic. At one time, the group counted up to 23 CH-47 helicopters hovering above the UFO. The UFO and helicopters disappeared off into the distance, and the group finally made their way back home. At approximately 1 a.m., Vicky checked on Colby, who had a fever. Betty also had a fever and was vomiting. Betty's daughter finally convinced her to go to the hospital because she was sick and her hair was falling out. The group seemed to be suffering from radiation poisoning and told their story to the press. MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, sent two investigators, John Schuessler and Alan C. Holt, to investigate. They interviewed the witnesses and visited the area of the sighting. This is the actual MUFON report. It was discovered that Vicky's hand had been on the roof of the car during the sighting and had an indented line across 4 fingers and a hole through the nail of her index finger. Schuessler had one important question he needed to answer. Where did the helicopters originate from? He checked with Houston Intercontinental Airport, and they reported they had no twin-rotor helicopters. England Air Force Base had no twin-rotor helicopters. Fort Polk had no twin-rotor helicopters. Fort Hood had less than 20 CH-47 helicopters, but only 5 to 10 are used during training exercises. The most likely location was Robert Gray Field, which had a training exercise on that date where 100 helicopters landed there. On December 29, 1980, at Bergstrom Air Force Base, the 3 UFO witnesses met with Air Force representatives at the referral of Senator Benson of Texas, and subsequently sued the U.S. government for exposing them to toxic radiation and trying to cover it up. Lieutenant Colonel George C. Saran of the U.S. Army's Inspector General's Office conducted the only government investigation into the purported UFO incident. He could not find any evidence that the helicopters the witnesses claimed to have seen belonged to the U.S. Armed Forces. Therefore, their case was denied, citing no such craft was owned, operated, or in the inventory of the United States Air Force on or about December 29, 1980. However, many years later, from a Freedom of Information Act request for documents regarding the incident, a handwritten note by Lieutenant Colonel George C. Saran states that 100 Chinook CH-47 helicopters did land at Robert Gray Field, therefore confirming Schuessler's initial research. On an episode of History Channel's UFO Hunters, they visited the area of the incident and took core samples of the roadway. It was rumored that this section of road was completely removed and a new road was laid in its place. However, this wasn't the case. The core samples showed signs of multiple repavings, even though county records showed no documentation of resurfacing since 1980. Retired Dayton, Texas police officer Lamar Williams was driving with his wife in the Huffman, Texas area when they saw several groups of military helicopters passing over the roadway up ahead. Jerry McDonald was in his backyard when he saw something very large pass above him in the sky. His initial thought was that it was a blimp, but when he looked up, it wasn't at all what he expected to see. Here is his drawing of what he saw. It was a large triangular object with two blue flames shooting from the trailing edge, two white headlights shooting out of the leading edge, and a red light in the center. So what are the plausible explanations? It's possible Jerry McDonald saw the F-117 Nighthawk or the B-2 Spirit. Both aircraft were in the developmental phase and would have been an experimental prototype since they were not yet in the Air Force inventory. As for the original witnesses, it's been proposed that what they saw was a prototype of the U.S. Army WASP program, which was to develop unconventional flying platforms for the military. Whatever they saw exposed them to levels of radiation causing serious medical conditions which lasted for years. It's also possible that what they saw was a test flight of an advanced, top-secret nuclear aircraft. Number 3. On November 17, 1986, JAL Cargo Flight 1628 took off from Reykjavik Airport en route to Anchorage. At 1711, the crew observed two unidentified aircraft on their left. The two UFOs moved to a position in front of their aircraft. Captain Kenji Terauchi radioed the tower to see if these UFOs were being picked up on radar. The tower responded that they had no unidentified traffic. As the UFOs flew closer, the cockpit of the aircraft became illuminated by the unidentified objects. The two UFOs suddenly shot off and disappeared into the distance. Captain Terauchi radioed that they no longer had visual of these two UFOs. But suddenly, off to his left, he spotted a huge unidentified aircraft the size of 4 aircraft carriers. As he asked the tower if he could see the object on radar, the object quickly moved toward his aircraft. Captain Terauchi requests to descend to 31,000 feet and receives the okay from the tower, then puts his aircraft into a descent. The UFO, however, descends with them. The air traffic controller suggests to make a right 360-degree hard turn to put space between Terauchi's aircraft and the object. Captain Terauchi complies, putting his aircraft into a hard right turn. After completing the turn, it seems to the crew as if the UFO has departed, and the tower confirms they have no unidentified traffic. But just seconds later, the UFO returns on radar and is now trailing the JAL aircraft. The tower radios to Terrucci that the unknown target is trailing behind him. Military radar has picked it up as intermittent traffic. The crew is unable to see the UFO. The air traffic controller radios United 69 and asks them to deviate their flight path to see if they could get a visual on the large UFO. United 69 vectors their aircraft as requested, and suddenly the UFO disappears from radar, and the turbulence around JAL 1628 has subsided. As United 69 gets a visual on JAL 1628, they report to the tower that they cannot see any unusual aircraft. The JAL flight continued on to Anchorage without further incident. Once on the ground, the crew filed a detailed report of the incident. Here are some of the FAA documents that were filed, as well as Captain Terrucci's detailed drawings of the incident. Days following the incident, a high-level meeting was convened at FAA headquarters, and John Callahan, the flight safety director for the FAA, was called into the meeting and ordered to bring all of the flight data with him. The audio and radar tapes were synchronized, and the group reviewed them and the flight data several times. At the end of the meeting, everyone was sworn to secrecy, and two men in gray suits took all of the data with them in briefcases. When Callahan retired from the FAA, he discovered copies of JAL 1628's flight data. These are the copies of the original FAA tapes of the pilot's interviews and the cockpit recordings. Captain Terrucci gave many interviews of his UFO sighting and garnered worldwide notoriety. However, he may have regretted doing so when JAL grounded him and moved him to a desk position over the unwanted and adverse publicity. After several years, JAL recertified Captain Terrucci, and he was able to fly again. Number 2. Late afternoon on April 24, 1964, in Socorro, New Mexico, police officer Lonnie Zamora was on patrol in his police vehicle when a black sedan went speeding by. Zamora called it in and started pursuit as the vehicle sped past the courthouse. The chase continued past the Socorro Rodeo and Campground, outside into the desert. Suddenly, Zamora heard a loud roar and saw a bright flame coming down behind the hills. Thinking some kids had blown up a nearby dynamite shack, he ended the pursuit of the black car. He turned onto a dirt road. One section was so steep, it took 3 attempts to get to the top. As he drove up the road, he saw what he thought was a white Volkswagen bus standing on its end, and it assumed it had fallen off a cliff and crashed. He rushed to get a closer look. As he reached the top of the arroyo, he called in that he would be investigating an accident. When he got out of his vehicle, he saw the strange white object down below. As he tried to comprehend what he was seeing, 2 very small people in white coveralls emerged from the bottom of the object. He started climbing down the hill, slipped, fell, and dropped his sunglasses. As he got to his feet, he heard a loud roar and saw a flame shooting from the bottom of the object. Thinking the object was going to explode, Zamora jumped behind some rocks. The sound became louder and higher in pitch. Zamora stood up and watched the UFO slowly rise vertically to about the height of his car on the top of the arroyo. Suddenly, the noise and the flame stopped, and the UFO took off at high speed, just clearing the top of the dynamite shack, and disappeared over the distant mountain. Zamora called in and reported what he had seen. New Mexico State Police Sergeant Chavez responded and observed the impressions in the ground and the smoldering bushes. Zamora made several drawings of what he observed, including a strange symbol centered on the side of the object. The The symbol was red in color and approximately 24 inches high and 30 inches wide. Air Force consultant Dr. J. Allen Hynek suggested to Zamora that he draw the symbol differently so that if someone else witnessed the UFO with the red symbol, they could eliminate hoaxers. Both the FBI and the Air Force investigated this incident. In this photo, Special Agent D. Arthur Burns can be seen observing the Air Force investigators check the affected area for radiation. The next few photos show the impressions of the object's landing gear. Stones were placed around the impressions to mark the location and to preserve them. This is how they appear today. Originally, these were V-shaped impressions, 16 inches long, 6 inches wide, and several inches deep. This is the FBI drawing from their report showing the measurements between the landing impressions, dirt burns, and the small footprints found at the site. This is the FBI measurement drawing of the 4 burned bushes in relation to the landing impressions. Project Blue Book Director Lieutenant Colonel Hector Quintanilla has reported that soil samples and samples of the burnt bushes were taken. Samples from both inside and outside the affected area were analyzed for propellant residue, the results of which were inconclusive. Quintanilla had initially thought Zamora witnessed a test flight of the lunar lander prototype. However, there was only one prototype at the time, and it was performing tests in Southern California at the time of Zamora's sighting. Number 1. On November 14th, 2004, U.S. Navy Commander David Fravor, Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, and their weapons systems operators were aboard the USS Nimitz, somewhere off the coast of Southern California, at a top-secret location. They were taking off for a combat training mission with U.S. Marines some 40 miles south of their location. Shortly after takeoff, the air traffic controller from the USS Princeton contacted them and reported that they had a real-world vector. An object had dropped down from 80,000 feet to 1 foot above the surface of the water in a matter of seconds. The 2 F-18 Super Hornets vectored to a location 60 miles west of their position. When they arrived at the coordinates, the 2 crews saw a partially submerged white cross T-shaped object with white water splashing onto it. They also observed a white tic-tac shaped object flying like a ping pong ball bouncing inside of a glass. Both pilots thought the submerged object was a downed 737. Fravor advised Dietrich he was going in for a closer look. He broke off and put his aircraft into a descent. As he spiraled down, the tic-tac object suddenly turns to face him and started to ascend, mimicking his movements, spiraling upwards towards him. Fravor maneuvered to face the object. The UFO sped up on a course directly at him. Suddenly, the UFO appeared in front of his aircraft. Fravor attempted to gain on the object, but the UFO shot off at an incredible speed toward the horizon and disappeared. Fravor asked Dietrich if she could see the object. The answer was negative. They decided to investigate the submerged white cross, but it too was gone. "30 to 40 seconds after the UFO disappeared, the Princeton controller reported that the UFO was now at their cap point, 60 miles away. The training exercise was abandoned and the pilots returned to the Nimitz. Back on board the Nimitz, the pilots were debriefed and reported what they had seen. A short time later, the Princeton controller reported to the Nimitz that the unknown target had returned. 2 aircraft were vectored to investigate. This time, the gun cameras were operational, and FLIR images were captured of the UFO. This is the actual footage from that flight. At one point, the unknown target breaks away from the target lock. One estimate of the speed to do so was 16,000 miles per hour. In 2017, the video was leaked to the New York Times. The Department of Defense has since verified that this is a bona fide U.S. Navy video. Following this incident, the U.S. military has captured footage and photographs from numerous other incidents. The evidence is overwhelming. Something is going on in our skies. Are we being visited from a distant civilization or another dimension? Or are we seeing the next generation of advanced military platforms? Only time will tell. So keep your eyes to the skies. I'm Cy, and you can watch me and ISO on our YouTube channel, Inside the SCIF. Go there now and enjoy this video.